We're in Tuscany in Italy, so naturally I'm thinking about the Romans and the Renaissance. I'm going to talk about the latter in a minute, but first of all, have a look at this incredible view we were lucky enough to find from our balcony of that church mosaic. Because I've made the claim twice now in two quite big videos that there's something special about the Renaissance. I made it in Does History Progress, where I said it contributed towards our understanding of the idea of liberty. And I made the same claim in How Capitalism Conquered the World, where I said the Renaissance opened up new horizons and contributed to our idea of the imagination in Europe, and that both of those things had a quite significant effect on the course of European history, especially the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and so forth. But the Renaissance, or the Renaissance if you're American, is a huge, unwieldy, difficult period, and I only really have a cursory understanding of it, and I find the literature on it difficult to get a grasp on, and I think that's because it's such a varied movement. So I spent a lot of time at the beginning of this trip thinking about a few books, reading a few chapters here and there, putting the kind of groundwork in to maybe think about a bigger video in the future. And this is what I've been thinking about so far. Because the other thing I need to think about is whether I'm being too Eurocentric. Almost everyone agrees now that there was some kind of divergence between Europe and the rest. Sometime during the agricultural, the scientific, the industrial revolutions, the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, the Reformation, all the rest of it. But there is a question of whether that was contingent, whether there was chance, whether there was geography at play, or whether it's to do with culture, whether it's to do with ideas, whether it's to do with economics. It's a really, really messy thing to disentangle. And as I said in How Capitalism Conquered the World, there are over 200 theories on why the Industrial Revolution happened. So separating the wheat from the chaff is a not insubstantial task. So the main things to know about the Renaissance is that it was the kind of end of the Middle Ages, pan-European, with the high point and the start as well in Italy, especially in the 15th centuries. It was a rediscovery of ancient texts. It was a looking back. It was caused by the Black Death, killing lots of people and making the survivors wealthier, a change in politics and culture, and of course a flowering of the arts, flourishing of political thought, and an abundance of new architecture and art from people like Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. And I think that's one of the main problems with Renaissance literature. Like, it is so broad, so that kind of suits my purposes, that I'm looking at it as an expanding of our horizons and our imaginative capacities, our liberties, not necessarily in the political sense, but I mean liberties in that knowing how to do lots more things, lots of different routes to choose from, whether that be in physics or architecture or art or politics. Leaning Tower. Obviously, figures like Da Vinci and Michelangelo are the most famous, the most recognisable images associated with them. But what they represent is progress and innovation in form, in anatomy, in architecture, in design. And much of this was inspired by ancient Greek texts. I mean, someone like Michelangelo, the archetypal Renaissance man, made the statue of David 5 meters tall, painted the Sistine Chapel. and finished St. Peter's Basilica. So in art, in sculpture, in architecture, he made great leaps forward. And much of this relied on science, the science of creating new cranes. Domed architecture was new. And with someone like Da Vinci, a focus on anatomy, important for medical advances in the future, really focusing on the human form. So that's one set of advances. Another parallel, broader innovation in the sciences was the rediscovery of Lucretius's ancient book, The Nature of Things, which was a naturalistic account of the universe, was determined by laws, and that you didn't need God doing anything once everything was moving. And this had obvious implications for the development of science. The scientific revolution inspired Galileo, Newton, so is really right at the root of the Industrial Revolution. Then there's literature and philosophy, and the big development here was an expansion in the range of books and manuscripts that people were reading and could be commented on, and this idea of fashioning a self. Petrarch was the first person to really collect lots of books that were maybe before considered to be blasphemous. He was the first person to have the idea of a public library. He said he had a sickness for books which he didn't wish to be cured. And then later on you had two figures at the same time separately, Montaigne and Shakespeare, that both had this idea of a self that you really needed to be true to. And Shakespeare said, "To thine own self be true," and Montaigne said that there is no greater thing in the world than to feel at home in yourself. And Petrarch had also had this idea that if you collect your letters and write letters and your different ideas across your lifetime, you become a whole. And from this we get the idea of authenticity and self-development and the focus on the individual self and how powerful that is, that really defines the Enlightenment and the modern era and modern ideas of human rights and so on. And this was really a part of the broader trend of humanism, which wasn't really humanism as we understand it today. It was more this idea that, yes, it was still religious, it was still a religious soul looking for salvation, but rather than be completely defined by original sin, the aim should be to get to heaven as a more fully formed person, so that you could focus on bettering yourself more in this life and you could look to more texts. So there was a much broader engagement with all these ancient texts as well as Christianity and the Bible, and that obviously had a huge impact on the development of European thought. Then there was a renewed interest in republicanism, especially here in Italy, in the city-states. Of course, it wasn't Italy then, it was a loose collection of, the papacy, Florence, Milan, Pisa, Venice, all these different states that would war with each other. But there was this interest through people like Machiavelli in a republican heritage, in ruling yourself, being free from outside coercion. And this looked backwards, obviously, especially to the Roman Republic, through that renewed interest in ancient texts from people like Cicero, talking about res publica, being ruled by the public. And that is fascinating to me because it's a really important part of our heritage, and there's an interesting debate about how much of our kind of rights-based liberal view of the world comes from this republican heritage, or whether it comes from a more modern way of looking at rights, a more kind of logical rational way of doing it that doesn't rely so much on history. But I lean more to the former, I think, at the moment. Then there was globalization, and most obviously through someone like Christopher Columbus, but kind of globalization in a few different ways. One, the obvious way of discovering America. Two, through new goods, spices, silks, new food stuff, this kind of thing. And also globalization in the historical sense as that renewed contact with different areas like Greece, like Rome, but also with the Islamic world, through the Moors in Spain and through the conquest of Constantinople in the mid-15th century. There was a cultural exchange of Islamic texts, European texts, books, ideas, but also, again, the Greek and the Roman stuff, a lot of which Islamic scholars still had copies of, translations of, worked with more readily than in Europe. So there's globalization in that sense.
So does it seem like there's something globally significant historically about the Renaissance? I think that's obvious. And I think especially if you get away from our very modern idea of liberty as being rights and think of it more of being an opening up of lines of possibility, of different possibilities in art and literature and architecture and anatomy and philosophy and history, connecting the ancient world to the modern, plus the innovation of the printing press and building techniques and so on, then yeah, it's hard to get away from the idea that it's a contributing factor to the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, to modernity more broadly. Now, have I done enough research to say this emphatically? No, I haven't, but it's a beautiful period of history, one that's integral to thinking about history in a big way, in a way in which we can use history to think about the future, think about what's good about the past, what to retain in the past, what to use from the past going forward. But do I know enough about the Islamic Golden Age, the relationship with innovations in China, its relationship with the ancient world and Christianity? No, I don't. So I'm looking forward to returning to this beautiful region and making a bigger, deeper video about the Renaissance when I can.